Thank you for downloading this edition of Radio 4's Start the Week, presented by me, Stephanie Flanders. Hello. Today we're talking about taking sides in times of conflict and seeing all sides when it comes to the thorny subject of immigration. The International Red Cross has had neutrality built into its DNA since it was founded 150 years ago this month. In conflict situations, its chief executive in the UK, Sir Nick Young, says it's more important than ever that the Red Cross not get caught taking sides. But the Channel 4 News international editor, Lindsey Hilsum, thinks the reporter's job is different. She was not neutral in the face of genocide in Rwanda nearly 20 years ago. Of course, war is only one of the reasons why millions of people leave the country where they were born in search of a better life. The Conservative MP Kwasi Kwarteng thinks the government's immigration bill will do a better job of ensuring that migrants to the UK have something to offer us in return. But in a penetrating new book, Exodus, the economist Paul Collier argues that the government is missing the point on immigration, and so is nearly everyone else. Paul, I want to get into the broader discussion in the book, but I think it'd be good to frame it. I mean, you're not interested in the question of whether immigration is good or bad. That's not really what the book's about. No, I mean, some immigration's obviously good. Equally, you can have too much immigration. But I think the starting point is to recognise that that migration drives diversity, and it's how much diversity do we want that we should really be thinking about. Some diversity is good. It gives the society more innovation, gives it more variety. But if you have too much diversity, then trust starts to erode, cooperation erodes, generosity erodes. And so there's a right amount of diversity. I can't tell you how much the right amount is, but that's what every society's got to agonise about. I mean, your background, you spent most of your time as an economist looking at developing countries, and I want to talk about the countries that the migrants leave behind a bit later. But I was really interested in your book. What I hadn't seen before is your focus on what you call on the diaspora, what the large number of people who've already migrated from a particular country in this country, and how much you think that affects not just the scale of immigration, but the broader effects on the country. Do you want to go into that a bit? Yeah, I mean, the most powerful driver of immigration is having a stock of the diaspora already in the country, because migration from a poor country to a rich one is daunting, it's costly, and the poorest people can't move. So what we get is people who are leaving countries where they have some money, but where they have good connections. And so as the migration builds up a stock of the diaspora, that's why migration accelerates. And the diaspora, the way you look at diaspora, it shrinks as people cease to sort of identify themselves with the country they came from and become more British, quote unquote. That's right. I think of the diaspora as the unabsorbed immigrants, the people who've not yet joined mainstream society. What I thought was interesting about it is the way you describe it, and I should say it's exciting to me, there's actually an economic model here, but you're trying to find a way of just talking sensibly about the different dimensions of immigration. And there's this sense that diaspora, the unabsorbed number, has a gravitational pull. So in a sense, you're pulling more people to this country the less absorbed they are in society. That's right, and that's why migration accelerates, but also, paradoxically, it's the more culturally distant stock of migrants who accelerate the most, because they absorb the least. Did you think, when you approached the book, did you expect to reach these kind of conclusions? Not at all. These were... This is why I'm an economist, right? There's an excitement in actually trying to discover analytic building blocks that then you can use to think. And what I tried to do in the book was share those building blocks with people. Exodus doesn't tell you what to think about migration, but it does tell you how to think about migration. What I thought was I want to bring in Kwasi in a minute, but what I thought was interesting was that as an economist, in a sense, you were saying the way to think about it is not just as an economic issue. I mean, throughout, you suggest that there's been too much focus on the short-term economic benefits. Very much. The short-term economic effects of migration are trivial. I mean, we've made too much fuss about that, and we've missed the fact that what really matters is the long-term social effects, the effects of diversity, both on variety, innovation, the nice things, but on the dangers of diversity. All the societies I work on poor societies have too much diversity. And so people have low trust, they can't cooperate, they're not generous with each other, there isn't mutual regard. And the genius of modern...
I mean, in African countries primarily as well.
Yeah, I work on Africa. The genius of modern societies, successful societies, is building mutual regard amongst people who don't know each other, outside the family.
I thought, well, actually, there's a sort of tantalising point at the end of the book where you almost suggest that that immigration will actually sort of reduce our capacity to be the successful countries, the UK, the countries that have managed to develop, will lose the race for economic growth by losing what makes them so attractive to immigrants, whereas the countries they leave behind might actually get their act together.
The countries that I work on, the poor, diverse societies, are desperately trying to reduce diversity. They're trying to build a shared identity. And we seem to be in the process of losing it. But everybody's entitled to one wild speculation at the end of a book.
Kwasi, what do you think of the book?
I thought the book was an extraordinary book in many ways because of the way in which it looked at the impact on the countries where the immigrants had come from, as well as the impact on the domestic, on the indigenous people in the country where they are arriving. And I thought that balance was very interesting. I mean, obviously, as a British politician, a member of the House of Commons, I'm almost exclusively focused on the impact on Britain and the kind of legislation that we can bring in to try and control, if you like, immigration. But I think that one of the things that looking at some of the figures and looking at the debate in the last sort of 30 or 40 years I'm struck by is the fact that this issue of immigration actually had reached a level of equilibrium in many ways in Britain. I mean, I remember, for example, in the 1997 election, I don't remember immigration being an issue at all, really, during that election. And yet, as you've observed and others have observed, in the last 10 years, immigration has really, risen up people's concerns, largely as a consequence of the numbers. And your book raises this issue of, when is too much, when do we reach too much immigration? But clearly there's a sense now, given the nature of the political debate, that over the last 10 years we've had hundreds of thousands of people, sort of 500,000, I think, in 2010, come into the country. This is becoming an increasing issue, and we only have to look at the papers and look at parties like UKIP and other parties across Europe to see that this is more of an issue. So, I love the book. I thought it was a very engaging book, but at the same time, I think that there is a historical context. I don't think we would necessarily be having this sort of debate 20 years ago. But
I think it's part of the point of Paul Collier's book that he says that this is something that does have a growing effect, the fact that, the growing diversity. I mean, it seems like it's one of those areas, Kwasi, where the politicians, at least until very recently, the mainstream politicians have been in a completely different place from the majority of the people. I mean, Paul says it's furtive and embarrassed, the government policy, quite often any government's policy on this. Do you think that you have run away from engaging with the cultural implications?
I think you're right in many ways. I mean, I was struck by the fact, and this is the political point, by the fact that the Labour Party has said, Ed Miliband said that on immigration we got it wrong, and I think that there was a sense in which we were open to sort of global market forces. There was a great degree of economic change, and in many instances, as the economy was growing in the boom years, people were more relaxed, or people in charge, as it were more relaxed. Whereas in terms of the public, constituents, people around the country, this was always an issue. And yet there was a sense in which the elites, the governing classes, if you like, for want of a better phrase, were sort of brushing the issue under the carpet.
But in the context of things like the immigration bill, I mean, you have been making the economic case for immigration. I mean, you've tended to...
Yes, I mean, I tend to be more on the kind of free market side. But I think immigration has to work for the country where the immigrants are coming to. And so what we can't have, you can't have Milton Friedman said this, but you can't have a system in which you have a welfare state and you have an open border policy, because there are issues, as you say, with trust. There are also basic issue of resources in terms of, and politically we find that this idea of benefits tourism, this phrase that keeps cropping up, is something which the public has no time for whatsoever, and it's the duty of politicians to address those concerns.
But you have a target, the net immigration target. I don't know, Paul Collier, do you think the net immigration target is a good way of thinking about
Doesn't make much sense, does it?
Just describe what it is.
I mean, there's kind of two things wrong with it, really.
But it's just, so it's the number, it's the net immigration, so the number who've come in minus the ones who've left, so the net change in population.
Yeah, so suppose, 10 million Chinese come in a year and 10 million indigenous English people leave, net immigration's 0.
That would be a triumph for the government's policy.
Yes, I mean, it may be crude, but it's a measure. And as someone involved in public policy, you have to have something that's quantifiable. And I think what we're saying is that given the context of the last 10 years, where you've had a net influx, if you like, of hundreds of thousands, all we're saying is that we want to reduce it to tens of thousands. Now, that might be a crude, broad measure for an Oxford academic, but it kind of makes sense.
But it also just doesn't get to this diaspora point.
It just doesn't hit the spot. I mean, I'm all in favour of controls. I think we've got to have quantitative controls.
Sure.
But we better control what matters, not what doesn't matter. And at the moment, we're squeezing down numbers by cutting out students. And all the evidence shows that what really, really benefits both us and the poorest countries is get students from them, come here, study, and they go back. They go back with skills, they go back with better attitudes, and they go back with affection for Britain. And yet we're squeezing that down. That's the easiest bit to squeeze down. So at the moment, we're controlling a net figure which could see, as I said, loads of Chinese come in, loads of indigenous go out, and we'd say, great, triumph. It's not a triumph. And we're cutting down students when we should be expanding that. That's our 21st century opportunity.
Lindsey, Hilsum.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question, Paul, because I just wonder if some of these models are old-fashioned, because what I see more and more is people going backwards and forwards. So, for example, from Nigeria, which, is a growing economy. Now, we have lots of Nigerians here, and then they go back, and their lives are actually between the two countries, or between here, America, and Nigeria. And there's, we've actually got all these new Nigerian novelists who are rather brilliant, talking about this diverse life they live around the world. Is that more of a model that we're going to see, not just for wealthy people, but for less wealthy people as well?
Actually, I'm right. There's certainly that element, and it's very fertile and stimulating. You're all going to live like that? I don't think so. I think the genius of modern successful societies is this sense of mutual regard amongst a people who extend their care for others beyond the narrow interests of the family.
But they don't have to be homogenous, racially or anything, do they?
Not at all.
No one's ever said that.
Anybody from any race can adopt any culture. With respect, sir,
sure.
Look at Kwasi,
Thank you very much.
And so there's nothing to do with race here. But there is a sense of... a sense of nation is the glue which enables equity to be reconciled with freedom. The French were right in saying liberty, equality, fraternity. It's the fraternity bit which reconciles liberty with equality.
Nick Young.
Well, the Red Cross concern in the UK is actually not so much about the broader question of immigration, Paul, but the issue of refugees and asylum seekers, many of whom come here, of course, to get away from really horrible countries, usually conflict-affected countries. And as we know, they can face many difficulties in settling in here. The system is really marked against them, and many of them end up destitute on our streets because of the rules on benefits and access to healthcare, for example. But in general terms, it does seem to me that as a country, we've come a long way from Enoch Powell and the Rivers of Blood speech, and that we have a lot to be proud of in the sense of the way we've managed immigration, we've managed diversity. I remember Ken Livingstone speaking very movingly in Singapore just after the London bombings and talking about what an incredibly culturally diverse city London was, and it would take more than a few bombs to destroy that. But I think what is interesting about your book is just promoting this whole debate about where we are going with diversity and what we need to do to remove the stigma that is very much still around the whole issue of immigration. The heat, take the heat in a sense out of the argument. But I think there are lots of process issues too, aren't there? I mean, the whole question of the process, which needs to be transparent, fair. The whole issue of trafficking and the terrible scenes we've seen in the Mediterranean over recent weeks suggests that this needs to be a debate not just in this country, but globally, certainly within Europe.
I mean, I think there are sort of concrete implications for policy here when it comes to the cultural, the diversity issue. I mean, Kwasi, I think you've supported the Mayor of Newham in the decision to try to spend less money on translation services and put more money into teaching people English. I mean, things like that surely do have a place here.
Yes, I mean, I think the Mayor of Newham's policy chimes very well with what Paul has been saying. And it's not about race or ethnicity, but there is a sense in which you have to build a cohesive society. And when Paul is talking about countries in Africa which struggle with diversity, that's exactly what this point is raising. And there are something like 100 languages, probably more, that are spoken in Newham schools. And what the mayor is saying is that actually, in order to build a more cohesive Newham, a more cohesive borough, we need to get more people to learn English, which is the common language of this country. And I think that's entirely logical and right to pursue.
There's something, isn't there, about the role and responsibilities of the indigenous community to help those who have come here get on in our culture, understand our culture, have access to services, understand the culture of the people who have come here, and recognise that will be very different.
No one's disputing that, but I think what Paul was saying, I mean, we look at Nigeria, for example. I mean, that was a country which was formed by colonialism and has 150, 200 languages originally and different ethnic groups. Now, clearly they struggle with issues of homogeneity or cohesiveness, not homogeneity of culture, but of cohesiveness. I mean, they fought a civil war, and these issues are a problem. And it's ironic, I think, in Britain, where we've got more diversity over the last decades. I think, it's relevant for us to say, actually, what we need to find is issues where we share common interest, and also language, I think, is very important in this.
I think that and that also speaks to why the debate is so much bigger now than it was 10 years ago. I mean, what was interesting to me from your book, Paul, is the question of scale, that it can be just a question of numbers, and particularly given that immigrants have this right to bring their dependents. Do you want to say something? Because I think that struck me as a very hot topic, which politicians do tend to avoid, but on your view had a really big impact.
Yeah, I mean, this one's tough. What are the rights of existing immigrants to bring in their relatives? Of course, the indigenous population has the right to, you marry somebody. If I marry somebody from Ghana, I've got the right to bring them in. But actually, not very many indigenous people marry someone from Ghana. And so that right works because it's not very heavily used. But of course, existing immigrants tend very heavily to want to bring in relatives from abroad. And so if we just extrapolate from the little used rights of the indigenous to say everybody's got the same rights, then we can more or less forget about all other issues of controlling immigration, because that bringing in of the diaspora's relatives will just crowd out everything else. And so we have to somehow have a discussion which says what is sensible rules about bringing in relatives.
Kwasi, I suspect that quite a lot of, if you did an opinion poll, there'd be quite a lot of support for limiting people's ability to bring dependents. And yet I suspect it's also something that you and other politicians will not necessarily want to go near.
Well, it's a difficult issue, and I think Paul is right. I mean, given the numbers of immigrants, if everyone who was of immigrant background decided to bring one relative, you could easily imagine there would be a problem. But what I wanted to get back to was this issue politically, which I think is the most important one. I think people in Britain don't have an issue with people trying to come here in order to make a living. But there is a sense in which if people are coming here and benefiting from the public largesse, on benefits in particular, that is what constituents of mine in Spelthorne and other people have a real problem with. And I think the issue of immigration is tied up with the issue of the welfare state to a degree which politicians and commentators and, forgive me, academics don't appreciate fully enough.
But where does that leave what Nick was talking about, which are the refugees who end up homeless, or the ones who drown? Off the coast of Lampedusa. This country has always welcomed people. This has always been a place where people can come for refuge. Now, of course, I understand that, not every refugee in the world is going to come here, but with your thing, you're saying about limiting benefits and so on, that's why these people end up homeless. And if we have this thing where landlords are the ones who are going to say, well, sorry, I don't really quite like your immigration papers, which is what the new law suggests, so you can't live here, then they're going to become even more of an underclass.
The bill is specifically regarded to illegal immigrants. It's not about legal migrants.
Well, you have to prove that you're legal, so it could affect you if you're legal, if you can't sort out your papers. And I know a lot of people here who, they are legal, but you know what? Their education isn't brilliant. They're trying to get a better education. Their papers are in a bit of a mess. That's the way life is. It's not a simple, clean-cut thing, is it?
No, it might not be, but I think the principle of a government trying to do something to limit that is entirely legitimate for the reasons that Paul is saying. I mean,
and to get landlords to do it for them?
Well, any society is built on mutual bonds of trust. And now if a large section of the public, if a majority of the public feels that people are coming in not from asylum seeker or legitimate refugee status, but are coming in order to benefit from the largesse of the state, then that is an issue.
They feel that, or whether that's true or not. It's to do with perception and reality as well, isn't it?
But perception is key in politics.
Nick Young.
Well, asylum is an issue. It's a small subset of the whole immigration thing. Quasi obviously, we're talking about 2,000 or 3,000 people who are actually granted asylum status, refugee status in this country. But the rest, those who don't get through the stringent tests, the difficult process, often language is an issue, they end up literally destitute on our streets if they don't actually want to go home because of the situation they've left in their own country.
I think that does take us on to what I wanted to go back to, which was the other part, I think also quite novel part of Paul Collier's book, which is your focus on the impact of immigration on the countries that migrants leave behind. I mean, do you want to say something about that? I mean, people do worry about the brain drain coming from these countries.
Yeah, I mean, most of my work through my life has been on the poorest countries, not our own. And so I started Exodus by thinking, what's the effect on the countries I work on, Africa par excellence? And it's a two-edged sword. Some migration is better than none for these countries, but they can have too much as well as too little. If by the time you get to a country like Haiti, where 85% of the educated young leave, it's just hemorrhaging the energy and talent that would otherwise build a society. Haiti is just trapped, and that is true of a lot of small, poor countries. The countries that have really done well out of migration are China and India. And that's first and foremost because they're so big that not many of their people leave.
And you make the point that in some sense they're the most defenceless, these countries, because they can't affect the immigration policies which actually determine how many people leave, the immigration policies in the rich countries. No
decent country is going to let people leaving. The only country I know of that stops people leaving is North Korea, so we don't want to encourage that. But inadvertently, our controls on immigration affect the rate of emigration from the poorest countries.
Kwasi.
But, I mean, there's a classic argument that would suggest that immigrants from Haiti, for example, who find out their way to America, often will be sending remittances to Haiti. I mean, what would you say to that argument, which is often a very important, I mean, it's one that's used to justify it economically from the point of view of the country from which the immigrants have come?
It's true, but it's a sort of Band-Aid. It's a palliative to poverty, so it provides some sort of safety net for the families that get their bright young kids out of the country. But that's all it is. It's a palliative at the expense of having an opportunity for the country to develop. To develop,
Lindsey,
these countries have to keep their talented people predominantly at home.
I understand that, but remittances are actually, it's much bigger in terms of money than development aid, isn't it? Isn't it $400 billion in remittances worldwide? It's more than development aid. And in many ways, I would say that it's probably more effective than development aid, because development aid, as you know, frequently doesn't hit the mark. And I suppose when I come back to, we've been talking about policy, we've been talking about big things. In my work as a journalist, I end up dealing with a lot of individuals. And this is where I would struggle, because I totally understand what you say about Haiti. But you know what? If I was a Haitian, I'd leave. That's what I'd do. I'd get out and I would try and earn a living, and I would try and send money back and do the best. That's the thing a human being does.
But reporting in these countries, you see what it does to them to lose these key people, to not have a reliable sort of infrastructure, not just a physical infrastructure, but of bright, skilled people.
Of course I do, but I also see that education opportunities are very limited. The universities are lousy, and in some ways it's much better to go abroad, get your education, and then I think the key issue is then what do you do? Do you stay overseas, or do you go home and build the country? And that, it seems to me, is the moment where you can talk about people going home.
Bravo, absolutely. So we should be expanding. We should be welcoming people as students.
Yes.
We should be welcoming people for asylum. But in both cases, they should go back. They should go back once they've skilled up. They should go back once the conflict's over. Because the poorest countries post-conflict struggle to get back their skilled people. Of course, it's generally not the poorest people who come here during conflict. The poorest people stagger across the border to a refugee camp if they're lucky. It's the elites that get out and come here. And
or
that's
the innovative and the clever.
Yes,
right.
But the innovative and the clever are the people who are needed back home post-conflict.
We could talk about this for the entire programme, I know, but I want to move on a little bit, although to stay in the developing world, because obviously many of those who are desperate to come to the West aren't just seeking a better lifestyle, they often are fleeing wars and conflict. And Nick Young, you're head of British Red Cross, and this is an organisation that for 150 years has been trying to alleviate suffering for people in conflicts around the world in a particular way by remaining completely neutral. Do you want to just tell us a bit? I mean, this month is the 150th anniversary. Remind people very briefly how it all started.
Well, it all started in a conflict. The founder of the Red Cross was a Swiss businessman called Henri Dunant. He was travelling in Italy and came upon the battlefield of Solferino and was absolutely horrified that the armies were moving off and the wounded were just being left dying on the ground. So he persuaded the local villagers to come and tend their wounds and look after them, and then went back to Switzerland and said, look, there needs to be a completely neutral organisation that can be active when there is a conflict, helping the victims, the vulnerable, the wounded, the prisoners on all sides, and regarded as completely neutral and given access to all sides by the combatants.
But war has changed so much since then. I mean, even that battle was one day between two identifiable sides. Now you have civil conflicts that go on for decades between different groups that are not recognised, armies or even militias. I mean, how has that changed the Red Cross's job?
Enormously, and of course it's made it far more difficult and far more dangerous. I mean, look at the situation in Syria today, where you have the government on the one side and on the other side 50, 60 or more armed opposition groups, and that makes it incredibly difficult for our brothers and sisters in the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, 22 of whom have died in this conflict already, and for our colleagues in the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the part of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement that deals with conflict. Incredibly difficult just to get across this whole issue of neutrality and impartiality. Yes, we can talk to the leaders of all those opposition groups, and we do, but the message has got to get down, way down beyond the leaders, to the individual soldiers on the dozens and dozens of checkpoints, government checkpoints, opposition checkpoints, gangster checkpoints, in order to ensure that the convoys, for example, or the ambulances get safe passage through each and every one of those checkpoints. It's an incredibly complex situation.
It's also something which in a sense is anathema to some people now, because the Red Cross, I mean, it's inherent in your mission, it's part of your, it's in the Geneva Convention that you have to enforce the rules of war, if you like. You're supposed to be trying to humanise quite inhuman situations. In a place like Syria, where no one's really enforcing the rules on anything, or a place where the rules have completely fallen apart, how do you do that? Can you still do that?
Well, we not only can, but we do. But as I said, it's an increasingly uphill battle, ensuring that the rules of international humanitarian law, particularly the Geneva Conventions, are observed by both sides, requires constant, patient, firm commitment and diplomacy with all sides to ensure that they are aware of the rules, and that's an issue with 60 opposition groups, for example, in Syria, obviously, and then that they observe them. And that does mean patient diplomacy behind the scenes rather than in the media to ensure that we continue to get access to the victims on all sides. And that does mean that we need to have access to all groups.
I mean, that has been controversial in the past at times, that silence, the fact that you are being behind the scenes. And some have said you've ended up, if not condoning, then at least making possible war crimes or making more easier war crimes because you're not shouting up like, for example, Médecins Sans Frontières.
Of course, it's a dilemma, and the fact that we don't shout and speak up and speak out publicly doesn't mean that we don't passionately care. Our absolute experience and observation over the decades has been that if you speak out, you are going to be denied access by one side or another, and so therefore better to maintain your silence and to deal with things firmly behind the scenes.
Kwasi?
I'm very interested in your role, particularly with regard to Syria, and the question I was thinking about was, to what extent do people on the ground, I mean, the militias in Syria, the various factions, to what extent are they aware of your function and your history that you've talked about? It seems to me unlikely, perhaps, that they would really be very conscious of who you are and what you represent. And they may well think that you're just another sort of Western front or Western organisation, if you like. And I know it's the Red Crescent, but that is interfering in their dispute.
I think that's the great challenge, Kwasi, is to make sure that they are aware. It requires absolutely constant dissemination in a conflict situation, but also obviously before a conflict situation. I mean, we have major programmes, obviously with the military all over the world. We have major programmes in schools to make sure from a very early age that people understand what those two emblems, they're our only protection on the battlefield, to make sure that they understand what those mean and that we are a force for good in the world, not taking sides, but seeking to ensure that the victims, the vulnerable victims, get the help they need.
Lindsey, Hilsum, you've said in the past that, a journalist's job is different, that you shouldn't be trying to be impartial or neutral about the truth, but you did actually pretend to be a Red Cross worker in order to get into Rwanda.
Yeah, I mean, this is a time for public confession, and it may be
I think that was a violation of the Geneva Convention.
I've violated the Geneva Convention, so we'll see what Nick says about that. No, on the whole, look, I think that I love the Red Cross, and I've seen the Red Cross do the most extraordinary work, and I've seen them saving people's lives and being unbelievably brave. But there comes a moment. I was in Rwanda, and the genocide started. I happened to be living there, and it erupted around me, and I was stuck in my house. And then I got a call from the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC at the time, in Kigali, and he said, where the hell are you? Come here immediately. Nobody is telling the world what's going on. And so I got into my car and I drove past the soldier who was stopping me leave the house. And I was terrified I was going to get lost because I have no sense of direction. And I drove through the roadblocks, which were full of red-eyed men with beer bottles and machetes and bodies at the side. And I just drove through, and without looking to right or left, and got to the Red Cross, and they said, well, we're going out to try and save people, and the only way that we can take you with us is if you put on the Red Cross emblem. So I put on the Red Cross emblem, and I sat in the back of the vehicle, and I went around with them, posing as a Red Cross worker. I'm not going to tell you what I saw because it's just too horrific. It's about as horrific as you can imagine. Hopefully you can't imagine how horrific it was. But at that moment, in that particular exceptional circumstance, they believed that the most important thing was that somebody should report what was happening, that somebody should get the word out, which I did. So I suppose maybe that's an example of, that there's always one exceptional moment when you break the rules. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, no, I mean, Rwanda was one of the very, very few occasions when the Red Cross has spoken out in a conflict situation, really because there was nothing to lose and nothing else to be done. The situation in Rwanda was obviously ghastly, and you played a key role, as the media often does, in getting the message out when others can't.
Lindsey, you've gone back to Rwanda to report on how it's recovering. You've written an amazing article about it in this month's Granter magazine. One of the things that struck me was the way that they are almost trying to write out, or at least they're changing, sanitising, if it were possible, the history of a genocide.
Yeah, no, I mean, I had been back. I mean, the genocide was in '94, and I had continued to go back for about 10 years, and then I just couldn't face it anymore. I just couldn't bear it, and I needed to go to other places. And so I went back for the first time in 10 years. And it, on the one hand, Rwanda it's touted as a development success story. I know that Paul Collier here has been there several times, and economically they have developed quite a lot, and that has been important. But I suppose I'm more interested in some ways about what's inside people's hearts than what's in their heads, and that's a much more complicated thing. And one thing that the government has done is, okay, the genocide was the majority Hutus against slaughtering the minority Tutsis. There was a government which believed in Hutu power, that the Hutus must exterminate the Tutsis. Now, one of the ways that the government has decided to deal with this is to say, there are no Hutus, there are no Tutsis, we're all one. Maybe this comes back to what we were talking about earlier, about diversity in society. But the problem is that that's not what people believe. So you go to the Butare Ethnographic Museum. It's the only ethnographic museum I've ever been to which makes no mention of ethnicity at all. I went through 7 rooms of, spears and baskets and, the huts that people lived in the 17th century. And it doesn't mention Hutu and Tutsi. Now, that's fine in theory, but then when you get out into the villages and you talk to people, of course, people know that there is Hutu and Tutsi because they still believe that, even if they're too afraid to say so because the government's told them not to say it. So that it's the power of lies, and that, I think, is very complicated when it comes to healing and reconciliation.
Nick Young.
Well, I think we all forget just how long it takes countries to get over these terrible cataclysmic civil wars. At Syria and Liberia, where I do a lot of work, the civil war is still very present. You go to Cambodia, the situation very much the same. And I think a lot more effort needs to be put into civil society building after conflict, capacity building of local institutions to meet need, local Red Cross, Red Crescent societies and other civil society institutions in countries where often there is no legal framework within which such institutions can safely operate.
Paul Collier.
I think, first of all, let's admit it's really hard post that Holocaust what you do. And I think the government's done a pretty magnificent job. They had a sort of truth and reconciliation process. All the evidence is that that's a good thing to do, and then the victors should not go in for vengeance and retribution. And so the best thing, have your truth and reconciliation process and then try and put it in the past. Rwanda's done an amazing job in building out of poverty. It's had the fastest reduction in poverty ever seen in Africa, right up there with China. This is a poor, landlocked country, no resources. They've done brilliantly. I'm going back in December. I think this is a triumph. Now, what's their strategy? Their strategy is to say, let's just try and grow people's incomes so that everybody's got too much to lose, so that by the time, of course, people will eventually recover their collective memory of horror, of course. And they have to come to terms with that, just as Germany did a couple of decades ago. But by the time that happens, ordinary people will have too much to lose to want to go back to slaughter. Whether that's right or not, I don't know, but it seems to me a pretty sensible strategy.
I partly agree with you. I think that there are a couple of issues. One is that they have exported their conflict to the Democratic Republic of Congo. So a lot of the fighting and vengeance, which is not happening in Rwanda, is happening next door, which may be good for Rwanda, but it's not very good for the DRC. And I think that the other thing is that Rwanda is an extremely complex society where a lot of things are hidden. And the same ideas which are used to make society stable are used for the government to keep power. And there is a pretense that it is not a government of one ethnic group. It is, really, and they pretend it isn't. And some of the Rwandans I know, including Tutsis who are government supporters, say that is our problem. Our problem is actually not addressing things straight on, but pretending things aren't there. And they feel that is storing up danger in itself.
How would you approach? I mean, it seems to me after this horrific conflict and ethnic violence, it seems that the approach that Paul was describing and you described seemed to be a sensible one. I can't see. With regard to the Ethnographic Museum, and would you have preferred them to talk about Hutus and Tutsis and how different they were? I don't see how, moving from a situation of such calamitous sort of violence, you can actually bring people together without, in some way, submerging those differences.
I think that you have to be honest. I mean, I talked to the curator of the museum, and he said, oh, no, Hutus and Tutsis, there's no such thing. It was invented by the Belgians and so on. No, that's not the true history. I think I have a Rwandan friend from the Tutsi diaspora. In fact, he's your classic example. He went to university here, and now he's gone home to build his country. Amazing guy. He said, look, our DNA, Hutus and Tutsis, 99.99% the same. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the reality of it. Let's not pretend that it isn't there, the divisions aren't there. Let's actually be honest about the divisions. And that seemed to me a much more forward-looking strategy.
Well, I wish we could talk about this more. But if you do want to see more, I do recommend reading Lindsey's essay on Rwanda in this month's Granta magazine, After the War. Thank you to her, and thank you to all my guests: Kwasi Kwarteng MP, Sir Nick Young, who will be taking part in an event to mark the 150th anniversary of the Red Cross at BAFTA in London next Tuesday, and Paul Collier, whose Exodus is out now. Next week, Anne McElvoy is in Gateshead for the Freethinking Festival. Details of how you can get tickets for the event on Sunday, 27th of October, are on the Start the Week website. She'll be discussing how our buildings and landscape reflect our changing fortunes. But for now, thank you very much and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Of immigration is having a stock of the diaspora already in the country, because migration from a poor country to a rich one is daunting, it's costly, and the poorest people can't move. So what we get is people who are leaving countries where they have some money, but where they have good connections. And so as the migration builds up a stock of the diaspora, that's why migration accelerates.
And the diaspora, the way you look at diaspora, it shrinks as people cease to sort of identify themselves with the country they came from and become more British, quote unquote.
That's right. I think of the diaspora as the unabsorbed immigrants, the people who've not yet joined mainstream society.
What I thought was interesting about it is the way you describe it, and I should say it's exciting to me, there's actually an economic model here. But thank you for downloading this edition of Radio 4's Start the Week, presented by me, Stephanie Flanders. Hello. Today we're talking about taking sides in times of conflict and seeing all sides when it comes to the thorny subject of immigration. The International Red Cross has had neutrality built into its DNA since it was founded 150 years ago this month. In conflict situations, its chief executive in the UK, Sir Nick Young, says it's more important than ever that the Red Cross not get caught taking sides. But the Channel 4 News international editor, Lindsey Hilsum, thinks the reporter's job is different. She was not neutral in the face of genocide in Rwanda nearly 20 years ago. Of course, war is only one of the reasons why millions of people leave the country where they were born in search of a better life. The Conservative MP, Kwasi, you're trying to find a way of just talking sensibly about the different dimensions of immigration. And there's this sense that diaspora, the sort of the unabsorbed number, has a gravitational pull. So in a sense, you're pulling more people to this country the less absorbed they are in society.
That's right. And that's why migration accelerates. But also, paradoxically, it's the more culturally distant stock of migrants who accelerate the most, because they absorb the least.
Did you think, when you approached the book, did you expect to reach these kind of conclusions?
Not at all. These were... this is why I'm an economist, right? There's an excitement in actually trying to discover analytic building blocks that then you can use to think. And what I tried to do in the book was share...
Kwarteng thinks the government's immigration bill will do a better job of ensuring that migrants to the UK have something to offer us in return. But in a penetrating new book, Exodus, the economist Paul Collier argues that the government is missing the point on immigration, and so is nearly everyone else. Paul, I want to get into the broader discussion in the book, but I think it'd be good to frame it. I mean, you're not interested in the question of whether immigration is good or bad. That's not really what the book's about.
No, I mean, some immigration's obviously good. Equally, you can have too much immigration, but I think the starting point is to recognise that that migration drives diversity, and it's how much diversity do we want that we should really be thinking about. Some diversity is good. It gives the society more innovation, gives it more variety. But if you have too much diversity, then trust starts to erode, cooperation erodes, generosity erodes. And so there's a right amount of diversity. I can't tell you how much the right amount is, but that's what every society's got to agonise about.
I mean, your background, you spent most of your time as an economist looking at developing countries, and I want to talk about the countries that the migrants leave behind a bit later. But I was really interested in your book. What I hadn't seen before is your focus on what you call on the diaspora, what the large number of people who've already migrated from a particular country in this country, and how much you think that affects not just the scale of immigration, but the broader effects on the country. Do you want to go into that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, the most powerful driver